Greetings, everyone, in Nairobi, Kenya. I regret that I could not be here to enjoy all of the different conference speakers that have been speaking during this week. I'm certain that all of you have benefited and enjoyed what people have had to present. I also wish to express how thankful I am that I have received this invitation to come and speak to you. Again, I wish I could be there to deliver it in person, but I am more than happy that my daughter and my son-in-law have made it possible for me to make this recording so that I can still deliver an address to all of you and that you will be able to hear me speak. When I found out that this year's conference theme was about faithfulness to doctrine, I realized what an interesting topic, what a topic that is really so relevant. There are those people who want to decry any discussion about doctrine because they say doctrine is never practical. I believe faithfulness to doctrine is practical. It is relevant for every age. And kudos for making this selection for this year's conference topic. Not only should we have doctrinal faithfulness in so many of the different topics that you may have heard this conference, I believe that doctrinal faithfulness is relevant even to the choice of the curriculum that we use as a theological institution. I imagine that most everyone in attendance today, either at Brackenhurst or maybe you're participating online like I am, you're probably an administrator or you're a teacher at a theological institution, be it a seminary, a university, or even a pastor's school. That should communicate to you the relevance of this topic. We need doctrinal faithfulness even in our curriculum. But then again, to understand how curriculum is tied to doctrinal faithfulness, we need to consider a well-known African proverb. You know this proverb very well. It reads, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. Well, this maxim applies to the African church, for churches go in the direction that pastors lead. And pastors will go in the direction that seminaries lead. And seminaries go in the direction in which their curriculum leads. But the curriculum must go in the direction that doctrine leads. And doctrine must be faithful to the person and work of Jesus Christ. Curriculum is of vital importance not only in how the church in Africa will go far, but also go together in doctrinal faithfulness. That is the relevance of doctrine. So then, to ensure doctrinal fidelity in our seminaries and our theological institutions, we must be deliberate and intentional about our curriculum. To be deliberate and intentional, then, requires that we know what curriculum is, what are the basic parts of curriculum, as well as how curriculum and Christian doctrine are related to one another. So then, let us consider what is curriculum. So many of you are in this room that work in theological institutions, be they seminaries or universities or pastor schools. I imagine the same is true for all of you who are participating online. Raise your hand, honestly, if you could give a simple one-sentence definition what a curriculum is. How many of us really can define what curriculum is? We've been discussing curriculum in our introductory remarks up till now. How many of us really know what curriculum is? The word itself, curriculum, derives from a word in Latin, currere, meaning course or path. This word suggests the race course that runners follow in an athletic competition. Certainly, education doesn't have anything to do with athletics except as an extramural event. So in education, what do we mean when we use the word curriculum? If that's its origin. In education, a curriculum refers to the course or the established path of instruction that one or more teachers follow to produce individuals that have been fully trained for a subject, a profession, or a trade. And so, for example, at the school where I have been a teacher for many years, Espetal, we have a curriculum. And that curriculum trains different called men and women for the gospel ministry. And speaking for men in particular, it is training them for the purpose of becoming pastors of local churches. And so the curriculum is the course that we in the faculty would follow in order to produce individuals that will perform the service as a pastor, because they have been fully trained for that purpose, for that function. So, having heard a very brief definition of what is a curriculum, it's also important to understand what a curriculum is not. So then, what is a curriculum not? Now, before we'll go forward and discuss what a curriculum is, we need to define all the different aspects that a curriculum is not. I imagine for many of you, many, myself included, whenever we hear the term curriculum, we might think that a curriculum is simply a notebook that's filled with lesson plans or lesson materials that a teacher can follow or use them as a guide in delivering lessons. Everyone listen to me very closely. A curriculum is not a notebook filled with lesson plans. Now, that collection of lesson plans may comprise the curriculum, but a curriculum is not a notebook filled with lesson materials. Another thing that curriculum is not, a curriculum is not only the list of courses that an institution teaches. So when you think we're going to discuss the curriculum, don't think in your head, okay, this is just a list of the different classes on the schedule. Now, to be sure, a curriculum includes the list of courses that a given institution may teach in a particular program of study, but a curriculum is not merely a list of courses that an institution offers. Another word to consider, a curriculum is not just a fancy word for education specialists that simply means course offerings and descriptions. There's more to curriculum than that. So these are just some important ideas, what not to think whenever you are considering what is a curriculum, what it is not. So then, what is a curriculum? How would we begin to describe what a curriculum is? Once again, there is another African proverb that I think is important for us to consider, and that says, if you don't know where you're going, remember where you started. Curriculum, from currere, is the course or established path of instruction that one or more teachers follow to produce individuals that have been fully trained for a subject, a profession, or a trade. So let's unpack what that means even further, and that will tell us what a curriculum is. A formal curriculum establishes an institution's vision, its mission, its core values. We'll explain what all that means later, but just know that that's the starting point. Formal curriculum establishes an institution's vision, its mission, its core values. The curriculum then establishes what it intends to produce among its students. In this case, for many of us, ministers of the gospel for theological institutions. Another aspect of curriculum, it lists the core competencies that a fully trained individual wants to acquire. In other words, if we want to produce pastors, we should list what are the essential functions that a pastor does, and we would write them down. So, for instance, a fully trained pastor knows how to study the Bible. A fully trained pastor should know how to prepare and deliver a sermon. A fully trained pastor should know how to offer some sort of pastoral care or counseling with members of his congregation. So a curriculum needs to list the core competencies that a fully trained individual wants to acquire. In fact, if you have done curriculum well, you should have a list of what are all of the aspects that we want trained people to say they have competency to do once they have left this institute. At least they have an idea how to move forward. They need to gain more experience, of course, but they have received training in how to do that essential function. Why is that? Because we've listed it ahead of time. We have been deliberate and intentional about making it a part of our curriculum. Another aspect explaining what a curriculum is that the curriculum organizes these core competencies into a set of established goals and objectives. I'll unpack what goals and objectives mean. Goals are broader. Objectives are small steps working towards the accomplishment of a goal. And if you have these core competencies, you're going to say, well, what does it take to prepare and deliver a sermon? Deliver a sermon, that may be a goal. But then objectives, those will be the small steps that work towards the goal of able to prepare and deliver sermons. Another aspect of curriculum that is very important that we need to consider is that curriculum recognizes some sort of education philosophy by which to master those core competencies that we've identified. They are organized according to its established goals and objectives. In other words, once you've identified as an institution what are the core competencies we want pastors to have gained, we've organized them according to goals and objectives. We have an education philosophy then that will say this is how we should go about teaching these goals and objectives that will work towards these established goals and objectives. So then, the educational philosophy should lead to a recognized learning theory. And by learning theory, what I mean by that is how we acquire new information, skills, values, and apply them in specific circumstances. That is our learning theory, and we derive our learning theory from our education philosophy. And our learning theory, education philosophy, just like our goals and objectives, values, mission statement, vision, all of that is what comprises the curriculum. So then, working from the learning theory, that leads to a pedagogy. By pedagogy, all I mean is the manner in which we are teaching the material. And then the combined education philosophy, learning theory, pedagogy work together to produce the core competencies arranged into specific goals and objectives, and that produces different courses of instruction. So, for instance, if you want people to have the capacity to prepare and deliver sermons, you may want a preaching course. But before they take a course on preaching, they may need to learn to study and read the Bible for themselves. So you will have courses on biblical interpretation or hermeneutics. They may want to have Old and New Testament introduction. You get my point. So then, each course of instruction works to achieve certain objectives that align with the larger goals of the institution. That is what we mean whenever we say, what is a curriculum? It's a lot more complicated than what maybe a lot of us were thinking. I know it's a lot more complicated than what I first thought before I began to read or study for myself. What is a curriculum? So then, this is all well and good. We've defined what a curriculum is not, what a curriculum is. Well, that raises the next question. How does curriculum impact doctrine? What's the relevance to doctrine to curriculum? Here's something that we must understand and really drive this point home in us. All education. I don't care whether it's somebody teaching a small child how to tie his or her shoes. There is no education that you receive that is not value neutral. What we teach, how we teach, why we teach, all of that reflects our values, what we believe to be fundamental about reality. And the fact that education is value-laden indicates why we should treat our vision, our mission, and our core values very seriously. Remember, vision, mission, and core values are the starting point for developing a curriculum. So then, our vision, realize this, our vision, our mission, and our core values, those inform what we want to produce. What we want to produce informs our goals and objectives. Our educational philosophy should reflect our vision, our mission, and our values, which direct our goals and objectives. Our learning theory should reflect our education philosophy that is aligned to our vision, our mission, and values. And the combined focus of all these different aspects that I've mentioned, starting with our education philosophy, going to our learning theory, going to pedagogy, vision, mission, and values, that combined focus, guided by Christian doctrine, should also reinforce Christian doctrine. Let me say that again. Our curriculum, guided by Christian doctrine from its very starting point, should also reinforce Christian doctrine. It's Christian doctrine that will guide us in the development of our vision, our mission, and our core values. It is Christian doctrine that will tell us what our goals and objectives should be. It should be Christian doctrine that tells us what kind of education philosophy we need to have. It is Christian doctrine that should inform how we develop a learning theory. It is Christian doctrine that should inform our pedagogy. It is Christian doctrine that will also guide us with every other step involved with the curriculum. If that is not the case, then our education philosophy, our learning theory, and our pedagogy may not reflect Christian doctrine, or at least they will not reflect Christian doctrine very well. Then we say we want to teach, we say we want to instill Christian doctrine in our students, but the way that our curriculum is developed, if it is not formed by Christian doctrine, it may take them in a different direction. And in that case, our curriculum will pull us away from Christian doctrine rather than leading us along the path to correct Christian doctrine. If curriculum derives from currere, meaning the race course or the course in which we take, and curriculum is the course or path of instruction, do we not want that path to reflect the Christian doctrine that we seek to proclaim? I believe it should. So then, having understood what Christian doctrine, what its relevance is to curriculum, let us now consider just a few case studies. These are just some examples that use some of the basic elements of critical design that will demonstrate how essential good Christian doctrine is needed to make curriculum and how your curriculum also reinforces and undercuts your doctrine. There is a proverb, an African proverb, that says, if you travel with lies, you will reach your destination, but you might be unable to retrace your steps. Could it be that one reason why so many Christian institutions, I can say this in the United States, and I know it's true in much of Europe, they have lost their identity. They have lost their Christian witness, even if they still call themselves Christian institutions, and it is because they lost their first love, Jesus Christ. And in doing so, they were not faithful to his teachings. And that lack of faithfulness to his teachings meant that doctrine became compromised, and that doctrine that had become compromised also impacted their curriculum. What they are teaching no longer even reflects Christian values. So to consider these case studies of how curriculum could go wrong or what direction we need to take, we need to first consider the how. Let me ask you this about the how. What educational strategies do you use whenever you teach a lesson in the classroom? I assume most of you still are teaching, even if you are administrators. Do you still simply read notes off of a page because that was the way that you received theological education when you were a student? True confessance, that's what I first did when I began teaching at a school in Nigeria over 20 years ago. I've grown past then, and I hope many of us will as well, if you haven't already. Or when you were considering the educational strategies that you use, the how, do you have the students select what topics that they will study, perhaps making your lesson more what's considered student-centered? Or do you prefer to demonstrate how one subject interconnects with multiple other subjects, let's say systematic theology and how it applies to preaching, how it applies to biblical studies, how it applies to all other aspects of practical theology? Your answers to the question that I just asked about the how, they reveal your pedagogy, the practices that you use to teach a lesson. So, for example, reading notes off of a page, that's an example of classic university pedagogy. A professor prepares lecture notes and he reads them off a page to his class. Another approach to pedagogy is what's called student-centered learning. That is, again, what I said, the students determine what subjects they wish to explore. That's a valid pedagogy. A lot of people follow it. That's a type of pedagogy that's called inquiry-based pedagogy. The idea that all topics are integrated and that we should show how one impacts others, that is the type of pedagogy that's called integrative pedagogy or integrative learning. Doctrine should lead us in our conclusions about pedagogy. Our pedagogy, which is part of the curriculum, should follow our doctrine. If doctrine does not guide us in our conclusions about pedagogy, then we may follow a curriculum course that follows the path of lies. And in that case, we may be unable to retrace our steps from where did we begin. Another consideration in what we're discussing today is the who, about what curriculum is and where curriculum is going. When I mention the who, what I mean by that is how you choose to teach implies who you believe your students really are. Are students primarily thinkers? In that case, then you follow what's called a cognitivist approach to learning. Or do you think that students must always learn by doing? That is an approach that's called behaviorism. Or maybe you think that students construct reality through social interactions, experiences, and information combined. That's a form of constructivism. Doctrine should lead us to our conclusions about who our students are and also who the teacher is. Our learning theory, part of the curriculum, should follow the direction of our doctrine. If doctrine does not guide our conclusions about who our students really are, then we follow the course of a curriculum that is the path of lies. It may not have completely fallen off of the path of correct Christian doctrine, but there is enough error along the way, and more error can beget even more errors that can become grave and serious errors. Another consideration in our discussion of curriculum or case studies, aspects of what goes into curriculum, is the why. Most importantly, in all of these questions, the how, the who, is really the question, why? Most importantly, our curriculum should reflect or indicate why it is that we teach, why we teach the way that we do, why we teach our students as a certain type of learner. The vision statement, the mission statement, and the values identified in a curriculum reveal our philosophy of education. Our education philosophy tells us why we teach in the first place. If you believe that reality is constantly changing, that we should adapt our teaching goals and objectives to match the changing reality, then it's a strong indication that you follow what's called a positivist educational philosophy. If you believe that reality is primarily this physical world and that natural phenomena are the main object of our studies, then you may follow a realist educational philosophy. If you believe that the primary goal of all human beings is to discover their own unique, authentic selves, to practice life that's filled with meaning and purpose, you may follow an existentialist educational philosophy. Doctrine should lead us to our conclusions about why we teach and why education is of value. Our education philosophy, part of the curriculum, should follow the direction of our doctrine. If doctrine does not guide our conclusions about why we teach and why education is valuable, then we follow the course of a curriculum that is the path of lies. Having discussed these different case studies, I want to lead us to an example of a theological institution. I'm thinking of a particular theological institution today. It's real, it exists. I will not identify it, names protected, guard the guilty, but I will identify a direction that it has taken with its curriculum. This institution has decided to embrace a curriculum that follows critical theory. It was the intellectual Thomas Sowell who wrote that it is not enough to identify where you want to go as a person, as an institution, or even as a society. You must also identify how you intend to arrive at your stated destination. Critical theory starts off at an objective that probably we should like. They want political freedom and equality for all people, even for those that have been, they believe, marginalized in the past. But how its followers choose to achieve those objectives, that's what makes it a problem. In fact, by its very nature, it is in opposition to Christian doctrine. Critical theory informs this school's pedagogy. Ironically enough, it's called critical pedagogy. Its learning theory's primary aim is political emancipation. Again, that sounds nice, but how do we achieve political emancipation? It's in the how that we encounter the problems. Its educational philosophy is informed by a type of neo-Marxism that's developed by an intellectual from the early 20th century by the name of Antonio Gramsci. Following an atheistic philosophy that informs the why will impact who we think our students are, as well as how we see ourselves as educators. It will also impact the how. Knowledge of Christian doctrine and faithfulness to it could have avoided this crisis before it ever started. And make no mistake, I believe that the developers of this curriculum at this particular institution, which if you haven't figured it out already, yes, I'm speaking about a theological institution in Africa. I don't think they sat down one day and decided we're going to walk off the path of Christian doctrine. I believe they wanted to be faithful. They looked at the goals or the objectives of critical theory and critical pedagogy and said that's good. They looked at where critical theory wanted to end. They didn't stop long enough to think about the how or the why. And as they made these mistakes, doctrine was compromised. doctrine, in fact, is being compromised. But if doctrine went into the beginning and asking the why, asking the what, asking the how, and then informing the developers of that curriculum, they could have avoided the errors that were made in selecting critical theory as the guiding light of their curriculum. So then, knowing and understanding by this example, this is what this is what curriculum is. This is what it is not. Here are some case studies as well as an example. Let us consider some current projects in which curriculum is front and center, and these impact all of you today who are participating in this conference, which is why I want to mention them. This is not merely me being self-serving. It is something that I want to mention because I believe that it is important for all of us, and I want it to be of benefit to everyone. Curriculum and doctrine are so interrelated that efforts are underway to develop church leadership curricula that follows Christian doctrine in its guiding principles. What is this curriculum that I'm talking about? Well, at the request of our theological education strategist for sub-Saharan Africa, Eric Lockhart, a team of educators, yes, I'm part of them, are developing a non-formal church leadership training curriculum. Work has only just started on this important project, but its availability will extend to all of sub-Saharan Africa. Now, to be clear, this is a non-formal theological curriculum. And when I say non-formal, what I mean by that is this is education that is not for a brick and mortar institution like ABTEN Seminary in Lome, Togo, or the Nigerian Baptist Theological Seminary located in Agbomoso, Nigeria. No, this is something that is more humble in its approach, but nevertheless still important because, in fact, in terms of sheer numbers, it could have a greater impact than all of the theological education institutions combined. And hear me as I say this, we need theological education institutions like the Nigerian Baptist Theological Seminary. We need theological education institutions like ABTEN, and the development of a non-formal theological education curriculum in no way, shape, or form is undercutting what these institutions will achieve. But let's be honest with ourselves. Africa has a lot of pastors, and by some estimates, as many as 85% of them have not received any theological training. And if we're really honest with ourselves, many, if not most of them, will ever get an undergraduate degree at one of our institutions, but they still need to be trained. And that is why this curriculum is so important. And that is why in the development of this curriculum, we are going to ensure that doctrine guides us in the production of this stated curriculum. So then, having understood this project, there is another project that I want to mention to you that will bring curriculum to bear. And there's a book that I have been co-writing, actually. My colleague, Professor Elizabeth Umbaru, and I have been working on a book. It's called African Pedagogy. It will, God willing, be published by Langham Publishers. And it is my hope and my prayer that this book will be available throughout sub-Saharan Africa, translated into English as well as French. And it is my prayer that this book will be of benefit to theological education institutions, which will in turn serve the Church of Jesus Christ in Africa. This book, yes, it discusses African pedagogy very specifically, but in discussing pedagogy, it has to identify its learning theory. And in identifying its learning theory, it also discusses its educational philosophy. I think you see where this is going. These are the building blocks to developing a full-fledged curriculum. And so while it does not go through all the steps of curriculum, it gives you many of the essential pieces. And so I want to recommend this book when it is available. Use it to inform and equip fellow faculty members, also institutional administrators, and even teachers in the making, those who are currently in an undergraduate institution preparing to become educators. And I pray that this book will help them to become even better teachers. So those are some current projects, but I want to give some further guidelines about what we need to learn. Just some guidelines about a doctrinally faithful curriculum. Number one, we need to have for vision. I think our vision needs to be led by the gospel. In other words, the gospel should be front and center and informs however we declare the vision of our institution. If we keep the gospel in the vision and it's stated forthrightly, I believe that will keep us on the straight and narrow path as a theological institution. We must be faithful to the gospel if we are to serve churches. In terms of mission, again, it's the mission where we declare our goals and our objectives. And I think our major goals at the institutional level should emphasize character, content, and craft. Now, what do I mean by that? In other words, they should impact what we think, what we do, as well as how we do them. Character is part of who we are. That defines us not only as teachers, as administrators, but also what we're going to be producing. Content, that is the educational content, the information that we intend to pass along to our students. Craft, that is them learning the essential skills that they need to perform if they are to be wise and good stewards of the gospel. They will be good ministers. And values, I believe that we should derive all of our values from Scripture, whether it's fruit of the Spirit, whether it would be values such as what Augustine noted in his own book on systematic theology, what we call the Christian virtues or theological virtues. I'm speaking about faith, hope, and love. We can have those guide us. Those are what I believe are guidelines that we should practice if we are going to be good ministers developing a curriculum that is worthwhile. As far as an education philosophy, time does not allow me to explain it in detail, but what I have developed in a recent dissertation that points at an education philosophy but goes just a step before it, I have developed something that I call theodramatic critical realism. I really wish I had time to explain this further, but it's what I believe we can practice that is faithful to the gospel of Jesus Christ and at the same time takes the sciences, particularly the human sciences, very seriously as they bear on theological education or just the task of education in general. Another consideration that we need to have in addition to our education philosophy, and that is a learning theory. And I described the beginnings of a learning theory to you in a previous presentation that I gave. It was actually at the very first ABTEN session that we had in 2018. I described for everyone a learning theory that I called multiple cognitive orientations. And Elizabeth Umbaru and I together put this in our book, African Pedagogy, and identified it as our learning theory. Multiple cognitive orientations just means that people on different settings, different contexts, learn differently. Some of us are more conceptual oriented. We practice deductive or inductive logic. Some of us are primarily psychical. It's really more about our feeling or our intuition. Others, however, and I describe many African learners in this third category, and that is concrete relational. We are concrete thinkers in relationship with others. So that is a proposed learning theory that I have been working for my own personal orientation towards philosophy of education, pedagogy, learning theory, which takes me to my next point. We've discussed learning theory, but that leads to a pedagogy. And once again, I identify concrete relational pedagogy as one of the prominent features of African learners, and I describe the need for fusion, in which we take time-tested and proven educational methods, but we also take African educational methods used in traditional forms of instruction. We combine the two in what a particular African intellectual by the name of Assi Lumumba has termed fusion, meaning we combine these elements together. We also can learn many important elements of orality. Orality does not have to mean no writing materials whatsoever. Orality actually can be very dynamic. There's more than one version of orality, and orality can even be employed at institutions of higher learning that have libraries, printed materials, and require reading because the students read from books. I know that because I have used orality in my own pedagogy and learning theory at Hospital Seminary and many other institutions throughout West Africa. We can do this in formal education. It's possible. So then, as we reach the conclusion for this presentation, I want to remind us again of this African proverb: if you don't know where you're going, remember where you started. We need to return to our biblical and confessional standards. And as we develop our curriculum, we need to remember our biblical and confessional standards. And those biblical and confessional standards are what develops our curriculum, and that is what our curriculum will convey to our students so that they will be fully trained, fully equipped to teach and to proclaim and to minister the gospel of Jesus Christ, whatever place where they may serve, be it a church or an evangelical institution, teaching, whatever the case may be. And that will edify and build the church, and ultimately it is God that receives the glory. Amen.